I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we will be looking at 10 more Webtoon Legends contest entries. As you may know, I made a post on the Webtoon Canvas subreddit asking for people's series to do quick reviews on, and I received an overwhelming response, so today we'll be looking at Herman the Merman, Monster Eating Slime, Lil BEBO, Candy, Retired Supervillain, Wings of Oil, How to Raise Your Werewolf, Strial, Samedi's book, DEITY 0, and Unscripted. And of course, these reviews are primarily going to be based around how well each of these contest entries sell themselves to the contest. And so we're going to be focusing on pacing, and we're going to be focusing on setup, and how easy it is to understand the ideas, and how well we might be able to grasp what the series is about, and the potential that it might have as an original, as a contest winner. And so these are quick reviews. They're not super in-depth, and I'm looking at them differently since we're judging them specifically as contest entries. Now then, we are going to go ahead and get started with Herman the Merman. Hold on, I missed my notes here. There we are. So this is a fantasy series by Shay Crawford, and the description reads, looking after his community is at the heart of all of Herman's baking, but when a mysterious messenger shows up at the bakery, Herman must decide if he's willing to leave his quiet haven and venture into the forbidden biome to save the Mer community who took him in all those years ago. So, this series is made by someone who I believe has done other comics in the past. Yes, has other successful ongoing Canvas comics. And so you can definitely see the experience that it's written with as you read it, and the clarity of what is ultimately going on in it. But interestingly enough, again, this is competing in the fantasy category, and out of everything that I've read of this contest, it actually is one of the entries that I've seen which has the most solid jokes, and the concept seems more like a comedy concept, and so it was kind of strange to me to see that this was categorized as fantasy under the most epic category, but it reads a lot more like a comedy slice of life, and I think it very successfully achieves the comedy slice of life atmosphere and vibe. But essentially this comic is about a merman who runs a bakery, and it's alluded to that in a past quest he has learned the ability to bake magic into his creations, and so he runs a very successful bakery in his small underwater town, bringing happiness to all and teaching recipes to the audience. And then one day, this sardine fellow shows up and tells him that the artifact has been stolen from the archives, and now Herman must reprise his role as some kind of adventurer and go on a quest to get the artifact back. And then we spend the remaining 2 episodes preparing for this trip by baking cupcakes. And so, again, I think that as a slice of life comedy, this achieves all of that effect very, very well. It sets up a seemingly important story, but kind of in a light-hearted way, and it delivers everything through a humorous lens, and it's got easy, approachable characters and a nice, easy-reading art style. It's, generally very consistent. It's very well done. It sets up the scenes really well. It sets up the characters really well, but really the only criticism that I have of it, other than the somewhat slow pacing, is just that I find myself questioning why it's in the fantasy genre. So obviously a story about magic baking and mermen would be fantasy, it is certainly dealing with fantastical elements, but since fantasy, the genre is under the most epic category, it just seems like this might be miscategorizing itself in the contest, and that might hurt it, whereas splitting this into 6 episodes instead of 3 and submitting it as comedy, I think it actually would have a really good shot, because it's a very easy to understand premise, it delivers an engaging story, and it delivers pretty solid humor, so yeah, I think it's clear that this author does a good job of building intrigue, of laying out the situation slowly and introducing concepts slowly enough that we as an audience can understand them, and explaining the complicated nature of the underwater archive, and slowly revealing how Herman is connected to it and the background that he might have. You find out over the course of these 3 episodes that this is more than an ordinary bakery, and that Herman is more than an ordinary merman. And because it is under the most epic category of the contest, I have to judge it as such, and I think, again, that's going to be the only thing that's really working against it here, since it's competing with all these really over-the-top shonen and action series, whereas what we have here in these 3 episodes are the start of an adventure that doesn't quite begin by the end of the 3rd episode, and essentially that results in 3 episodes of people hanging out in an underwater bakery talking about an adventure that they might go on. And so I think that for a most epic entry, it doesn't really get to the point fast enough. It doesn't really show us the epic aspect of it. It just kind of talks a little bit about it, but under epic, you would expect big, grandiose fight scenes and interesting altercations and very, very high stakes, whereas this doesn't really seem like it's that kind of series, and if it is, we're not being shown that, and so I think, again, this is a very solid entry. It's very competently written. It has consistent artwork. It's always easy to understand what's going on, what the point of it is, what the stakes are, but I don't think the pacing quite matches the category that it's submitted in. I don't think the atmosphere does either, and I hope that that doesn't work against it, because it is very well made, and it's very easy to read and speculate on where it might go and what the overall tone of the series is. And so this one is a little conflicting, because again, as a most laughs entry, I would rate it very highly, but as a most epic entry, I feel like it's completely missing the point of that category, and so I would really question why it got submitted under most epic. And again, it's just a matter of maybe it is a really epic story, maybe it gets much faster paced later, maybe it gets more tense and more exciting later, but if that is what direction this series is going to take, we would want to see that a lot sooner, because as it stands, this almost reads like a slice of life. And so while I thought it was very good, it's really well done and it's fun to read, I just don't think it's going to be competitive in most epic. But I did enjoy it, and I would like to see where it goes. Okay, next we're going to be looking at Monster Eating Slime by Joan D. This is a fantasy series. This is also under most epic, so you'll kind of see what I mean with what I said about the previous entry, but the description reads, in 2085, a massive asteroid struck Earth, destroying half the planet and leaving only a handful of survivors. From the deep crack it left, monstrous creatures, soon called demons, emerged, hunting humans relentlessly. The population dwindled, pushing humanity to the brink of extinction. 50 years later, the survivors rebuilt a nation from the ruins. Now, they must fight to defend what remains. Will humanity vanish from the face of the earth forever? And immediately, just by reading the description, you can kind of see there's a very different tone. Whereas this style of description is pretty common of this category. So, yeah, this series establishes our scenario pretty quickly. Humanity is struggling, they're on the brink of death, and they're using new technology to try and fight back against these monsters. And I think the first episode does a pretty good job of establishing the type of fights that we're going to get in this, the type of action that we're going to get in this, the type of stakes that we have, and the way that things work. So we're building out this military structure of this human resistance force and showing how difficult their predicament is. They have to fight against these demons of varying levels, but the highest level ones are not susceptible to most weapons, and so it's taken some adaptation, and we've seen how the survivors have kind of created these more powerful form of fighters in order to be able to actually challenge these demons. And so right off the bat, we're doing a good thing here by kind of starting with an action sequence and demonstrating the type of fight that this comic is going to have in it. And so we're immediately setting the tone, setting the stakes, and kind of building out the power scaling and kind of giving the audience an idea of what type of action they can expect in this. Let's put a like on that, and then we end up finishing this sequence with episode 2. And so this is a very good way to approach this type of series, just kind of showing it from the perspective of low-level operators in a combat zone as they are encountering the higher-level operators that we assume the story will probably be more closely about. And what that does is establish, again, the power scaling, so we can see immediately we've got this scouting team. The scouts are not very strong on their own, and they're terrified of this high-ranking demon that these higher-ranking hunters are called in to deal with, and they take it out without too much effort. And so again, this just kind of helps build out the audience understanding of the differing levels of strength between our heroes and our villains. And so all very well done. I do think that the action sequences could be perhaps a little bit more impactful. We see that our heroes defeat the towering demon by giving it a bear hug with a robot and then shooting it. And so this, again, just kind of shows us generally the way that humans are forced to fight against these things, but I think that perhaps a more climactic ending to this scene could have really helped drive home just how awesome these hunters are meant to be. And again, since we're starting off our series by following high-level operators, by following the best of the best in terms of humanity's fighting force, it would be good to kind of go over the top, I think, with the combat and really drive home what types of things are in store for us. And so having a demon be, held back, immobilized by a robot, only to be executed with a shot to the face, I think is a very efficient way of ending the conflict, but I don't think it builds quite as much tension as perhaps a more compelling fight scene could have done. But again, from a writing standpoint, we have done well to establish kind of what the threat is and what types of altercations we're going to be getting here. And in a action-centric show, that's very important to do right away, especially if you have a complicated lore and a long backstory to set up. And so after episode 2, we jump into the city. We're back to just average citizens who haven't yet joined the military, who dream of becoming soldiers one day, but aren't there yet. And so now we're going to build out what is probably our main cast, and we're going to establish our cast of high school friends and show kind of what each of their personalities are, but also how they go on to become, presumably, fighters like the ones that we've been introduced to. And by the end of the 4th episode, we don't quite finish setting that up. And so that's one thing that I would criticize. I think that the opening sequence, the first 2 episodes, does a pretty good job of setting the stage for this comic. But since we spend 2 episodes on that, we've kind of got a bit of a lopsided opening segment, whereas usually you want to have the entire series, at least tonally, and the basis of the plot, the inciting incident, you kind of want to have that happen within 3 episodes, or at the very least as soon as possible. And so we've got some interesting things going on in the background. There's a slime going around, kind of clinging on to people. We don't really know what it's doing yet, and that's left open-ended. And so we keep getting these cutaways to this here up next, so we know that whatever this is presumably on its way, and it's the suit that he's wearing is the same color as the slime, so that kind of hints at what is going on with that. But we don't really get the resolution to that, and so I think that with that concept being introduced, it seems like it's setting up our main character here to be some kind of abnormally empowered fighter utilizing this mysterious slime, and he's probably going to have unique abilities that will propel him into the front line and cast him into this war against these demons. But we can guess all of that, but we don't know for sure if that's what's going to happen, because we don't quite get there. And so if we're trying to really set the stage for this series and kind of set the course, determine what direction we're going to go, we would really want to have that all happen in the body of the contest entry. We would want to get right to the point with that. And so we could maybe shorten the intro fight and spend more time on this, building this character and kind of showing how he gets involved in this, how he becomes this monster-eating slime. Or otherwise, we could lengthen the intro segment and focus on that just to establish what type of series this is. But I think that if our main character is going to be... Let's see if he shows up again. No, I don't think he does, but... Let's put a like on this. We'll scroll back up. But yeah, so if this gentleman is going to be our main character, then we probably would want, during the contest entry, to establish his connection with the slime that seems to be giving him some kind of powers, because we want to establish what type of powers he has, what's special about that, and how that sets him up for future interactions with this conflict that he's probably going to be involved in. And so it feels like with this one, it kind of ends in an awkward spot, and again, just based on other fantasy stories that we've perhaps read before, we can kind of assume what direction this is probably going to go in, but we don't really know for sure. And so I think that starting with an action sequence was a good idea for a most epic contest entry, but I do think that this would have been stronger as an entry if we had established what the monster-eating slime was, what that super suit is, and how it empowers our main character. And so it feels like we've kind of ended right before the most important part, which is our hero becoming the hero that he is probably going to be. And so I think that this does a lot of things pretty well, but it's a little unfortunate where it ends, because we are left wondering what's going to happen next. There's certainly enough intrigue built, but we also don't have quite enough information about the slime that is going to probably be the inciting incident. And that's something we really want to have within our first 3 episodes, is the inciting incident. And so without the slime meeting the main character, we haven't quite finished setting that up. And so that is one thing we perhaps could do differently, although I do think this is a very interesting idea. I like the concept of it, and I'll be curious to see where it goes. Okay, next we have Lil BEBO. Here's a heartwarming comedy by Sen Esparza. The description is very to the point. It says, "The most intelligent baby is born. His name is Lil BEBO, and he can make you happy." Lil BEBO, maybe it's Lil BEBO, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it exactly, but it's probably one of those two. So, This is, of course, a comedy series, and it is exactly as described in the description. We have our main character who is preparing to jump off of a building when he collides with a stork and accidentally ends up adopting a baby, the titular character, who becomes bonded with him, and now he has to raise this baby. But it turns out to be a super intelligent baby who is also an overwhelming force of positivity. And so we have the contrast of a depressed man who is ready to give up on life with a talking baby who only cares about happiness. And this is one of those types of stories where it's a very, very simple premise. It's not really that deep. It's not really that complicated. It's about a sad man and a talking baby. And so, story-wise, there's not a whole lot to latch onto or bite into. It's really just kind of a situational comedy centered around the dynamic between this man and this baby. And so ultimately the quality of it will come down to whether or not you find the humor funny, whether or not the jokes land. Personally, I think most of them do. I think it's reasonably funny. I think it does a good enough job of kind of understanding the pacing expected of a comedy of this nature. It doesn't spend too long on details. It doesn't really give you many details at all. It kind of just focuses on the way these characters' differing personalities get them into these silly situations that have funny payoffs. And so, overall, I would say it's very well done. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a whole lot really to say about it. It's pretty good. It's reasonably funny. And it understands what it needs to be, and so I could easily see this being an ongoing series of shorts, which is essentially what it is in its current state. We have a very loose plot, which is just our baby's first day in the real world being shown around by his new parent, and again, we just see how this absurd situation gets us into trouble, but in a generally fun and positive way. And so, yeah, I would say I enjoyed it. I think it's very enjoyable, and it's clear that this is a creator who understands the tone and understands building comedy with comic panels, and probably has been doing this for a while, I would imagine. I think it definitely works very well for what it needs to be. It's very efficient. And ultimately, as I said, with a comedy of this nature, I mean, the art is solidly as good as it needs to be. The paneling is easy to follow. The text, all of the boring clinical aspects of making a comic, just making that sure that it's readable, making sure that it flows, having it in the right format, all of that stuff is good. And so ultimately what it comes down to is just, is it actually funny or not? And at least for me, I found that it had some solid, funny jokes. Probably my favorite one was the second episode, but it does a pretty good job of building out its humor. And so, yeah, if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, I think it's definitely worth taking a look. It's kind of hard to make any suggestions for it because it kind of is doing everything well. It will ultimately just depend on if the judges think it's funny, if it's the type of humor that they're looking for. So I think it has a solid shot as far as comedy goes, and it clearly understands what the genre is looking for. So very good job on that. Okay, we have another slice of life story. This is Candy. It is a slice of life short story by Helio Yu. And the description reads, when a salon owner gives a struggling barber an ultimatum, he is urged by his friend to attend the party of the year and comes up on an unlikely romance based on everyday life in Cabo Verde, West Africa. So, speaking of the comedy genre, since this series, Candy, is also under most laughs, it's a slice of life, and so slice of life and comedy both fall under most laughs in this contest. And so unfortunately, it seems like the expectation is that really when they say slice of life for this, they're looking for more of a low stakes comedy, considering that it's, again, in the most laughs category. And so with this series, I did think it was interesting, it was entertaining to read, but it's really more of a drama romance that happens to have a joke here or two. It's relatively lighthearted, it's relatively low stakes, and I think that it has the occasional humorous moment just built off of the characters' personalities and how they interact in a very realistic and believable way. But it's not really a comedy, and I think that might hurt its chances a little bit just because the way the category is labeled. But yes, this is a series about a barber who is struggling to bring in clients, and he goes to a party with his good friend. He ends up meeting someone who is connected with the DJ at that party. They end up falling in love, and they meet each other before the party, but then they meet again at the party, and then that's kind of how the meet cute, that's how the coincidental romance begins. And then this culminates in Dennis getting more clients and sets us up for potentially an interesting and lengthy relationship. So what you might notice about this right away is that it is kind of paneled in page format, which I think is going to hurt its chances a lot, because Webtoons as a platform is primarily focused on mobile. An overwhelming majority of the readers are reading on mobile devices, and so in order for a comic to be readable, it needs to be formatted with that in mind. And so if you have the panels in a page format like this is going to be taking up the entire phone screen, but the text is a little too small. You're not going to be able to read this on a phone without zooming all the way in, and then if you zoom all the way in to read the panel, then you have to swipe between left and right to keep reading from left to right, top to bottom. And so you really want to put these all vertically. And so you could take these exact same panels and just stack them on top of each other vertically and expand them to fill the entire frame, and then that would make it essentially, that would be putting it into scrolling format. And then even if you did that, I think the text still might be a little bit too small. And so the formatting is very important. I think that's something that Webtoon obviously looks for. They want to make sure that a comic is designed with that in mind, because mobile is such a big part of their market. And so you really want to make sure that a comic is delivered in vertical format. However, if the content of the comic is good, I think that it isn't too difficult, again, to take something like this and split it into vertical. And so if you have a compelling enough story, it probably still has a chance, since the transition from page format to vertical format, when we have these big square panels, is actually not very difficult to do. And again, I think that this story does a good job of establishing characters and personalities and just believable interactions, and as a slice of life, it does work rather well. My biggest concern with it is just that because slice of life is under the most laughs category, I think that there might not be enough humor for this to compete with some of the other things in that category. It's really, again, more of a drama romance, and it's clear that those things are kind of more important to the story than the humor is, and that's something that might hurt its chances a little bit. But think that it does a good job of building these scenarios and, again, establishing our characters, but the only downside to it being more dramatically focused, more of a drama/romance, is that since it's submitted under Most Laughs, it only has 15 panels as a minimum for its episodes, and so the episodes are a little short, and so for a dramatic romantic story, you really want to kind of hammer in the lives the characters are living, the personalities that they have, and so since we don't have as much time to get to know them, and we have so many characters being introduced over the course of this, it feels like we could be going into more depth on that if we had more panel space to do it. But yeah, I did find it to be an entertaining read. It again, it definitely has some formatting concerns, and I think that it has perhaps genre concerns as well, but it does do a pretty good job of what it's trying to do with the more dramatic aspects, and so I think there's definitely potential here, and so I wish you luck with this. Okay, next we will be looking at Retired Supervillain by Esper120, and this is a comedy superhero series, and so I'll read the description and then we'll have a look at it. Evil Villain is the most sinister supervillain of all time. He spends his life committing evil deeds that anyone would consider monstrous. Crashing a school bus full of children, you bet. Evil Villain is on the case. However, when an ordinary neighbor moves in next door, Evil Villain is forced to confront him, unaware that his new neighbor is secretly a superhero. So, this is a pretty simple concept. It's not too deep or complex, but yeah, we have textbook evil villain who happens to be living next door to a textbook superhero, and we see the way that their living situation causes them various misunderstandings and altercations, and it's a pretty simple comedy setup. And I found it kind of hard to understand at times, and so there's kind of a lack of clarity in the scenarios that we have going on, and just the kind of the way that they're delivered, which can make it difficult to follow at times. And unfortunately, with comedy, if it's difficult to follow or if some of the details are being lost, then it can result in the jokes not really landing. And there's also a lot of empty space in between each frame, and so sometimes it feels like a really long scroll with blank space in between the next panel, which also breaks the pacing up perhaps a little too much. And so for a simple series like this, we want to make sure that we're really doing as much as we can, again, to build clarity and build out the scenes and really make a clear setup, since setting up, you know, the joke, setting up your punchlines is one of the more important parts with comedy. And so, again, in order for a joke to land, it's very important that the reader understands everything that is involved in it, everything that's going on, what the stakes are, and kind of what the scenario is. And at times, it's very easy to get lost just in between the panels here, and it's not always clear exactly how each panel leads into the next one. And again, it's a little confusing, which is really the enemy of this style of simple setup payoff comedy. So I would definitely recommend having some of the panels be a little bit closer together without these really, really long scrolls in between them, because it's important to factor in that, yes, this is a visual medium. It's a comic, and so you don't have the audio aspect that you would have with video, but the vertical scrolling format of Webtoon kind of mimics that style of video playback pacing, and so it's really important to make sure that the rate that the reader has to scroll at kind of matches the pace that you want them to go at. And so this one, again, for a comedy, it's usually better if the pace is a bit faster. And so for a cartoon comedy, a simple concept where we have wacky characters in silly situations, we don't want to feel like we're having to scroll for too far, because then it just feels like the scenes are playing out very slowly when it's clearly not what's intended. And so kind of mastering the format of this type of comic is really important. Okay, another thing we have here is not really a story, but there's kind of a simple plot through line wherein our superhero moves into next to the evil villain because he's trying to stop him, but then upon living next to him, he starts to observe that, well, maybe he's not evil after all, I don't know, and then he starts to feel that he's been unfairly going after this guy, and then he retires from being a superhero, and then the evil villain signs him up for a dating app, and that joke doesn't pay off. And so as far as the overarching plot goes, again, there's not a whole lot of story, but what little we've got kind of ends in an interesting cliffhanger where we've set up probably our next silly scenario, which is the superhero being catfished to go on a date that he doesn't know he's meant to be going on. But I'm not sure if it's enough to really get latched on to where we truly feel invested in it, because we just don't know enough about our superhero already to speculate on how he might approach this situation. And I don't know, I feel like as a comedy, it's good to have, for this style of comedy, it's good to have a simple and straightforward premise, something that's easy to understand. It's a villain and a superhero living next door to each other, but I do feel like our situations need to be a little bit more understandable, and I think that, again, the way that this is laid out and the way that the art is kind of makes it hard to follow the scenes sometimes. And so just a little bit more clarity is what I would recommend to this, taking the time to really work on building the scenes and establishing where the characters are at and what they're doing at all times would help more of the jokes land, in my opinion. But I think it's clear that there's an understanding of what's expected out of comedy here. I just think that the execution could be a little bit stronger. But I do tend to say that understanding the genre, understanding the category that you're competing in is a very, very important first step, especially with Webtoon. And so it seems like that's something that they really emphasized in the rules for the contest and something that they really put a lot of focus on. And so I think that this does a good job of that. It very clearly understands what a comedy is meant to be and kind of what the expectations are. I feel like it's not quite hitting the mark all the way. And so there's definitely room for improvement here, but I wish you luck. Okay, next we have Wings of Oil by Hannah Alexandra. This is a fantasy romance. I'll read the description and then we'll dive a little bit into it. It says, two warring groups, the Divisites and the Noxians, are trapped in an eternal war. Using magic oil, soldiers can bring ancient fossils back to life to use as weapons. The Noxians are burning through oil too fast. They send their best archaeologists, amber burrows, to find the legendary oil reserve, in hopes of saving their army. Little does Amber know that the Divisites also sent their best archaeologist, Oren Sternberg, to find the oil. For he who controls the oil controls the world. So, this is a very interesting premise. And I believe the person that made this is... I thought I looked into this. I thought this was the artist for a former original, but it might be listed under a different account or something, or I could be confusing it with someone else. But it's clearly someone who has an understanding of, you know, what it takes to make a comic and how to pace a story and whatnot, and so it does a good job of that. My biggest concern with this one is, as often is the case, just kind of the genre and what the focus of the story actually is. And so this being a fantasy romance, it is of course under the most epic category. Although it does seem to have a romance thumbnail, and so this is something that, if you've read a lot of webtoons like I have, you'll see that a very common romance thumbnail is two characters' faces very close together, maybe about to kiss, and so it's kind of got the romance thumbnail, and romance is the subgenre, but I do think that categorizing it under fantasy in its current state is probably the correct choice. It's just kind of not clear what the overall direction of the story is going to be based on the way it's presented right now. And so I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. I think it's setting up a lot of things, but it's a little bit meandering. It's exploring so many concepts and setting so many things up that it's a little bit hard to tell what the overall focus is. And so let's dive into it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we have a active war zone as our opening scene, and we're showing how our warfighters are using oil to attack each other, and so this acts as a very good visual demonstration of how the oil mechanic works. We have a fossil, we put some oil on it, and then that creates magic, and so essentially, this is introducing us to the mechanisms of the world, and so this is the thing that everybody's fighting over. They need this oil in order to sustain fight against their enemies, but they're running out, and so that is our base level conflict. We've got two nations at war with each other, and both sides need oil in order to continue the conflict, but one side is about to run out. Something that I think a small problem that this series runs into is very common in real life, especially in the World War I or II era that this conflict seems to be taking influence from, but our protagonist and antagonist uniforms actually look very similar. They have similar color schemes. They're meant to blend in with the landscape, and so it can be a little hard at times to tell what side a character is on. And in the real world, that's pretty realistic. That is a phenomenon that happens, but in a comic, we really want that visual clarity. And so I think as a outsider reading this, it's a little bit difficult at times to tell who we're following and what side each character is meant to be on. And there are small clues. There are little things like the Divisites. They have these arrow-shaped buttons, whereas the other guys have round buttons. But other than that, their uniforms look very similar to each other, and so it's easy to miss those little details and not really be sure. And so just from a storytelling perspective, from a visual, like film language perspective, it can be good, even if it's not realistic, to have high contrast between the uniforms that the characters are wearing, or otherwise have more obvious symbolism, like big emblems or crests, little things like that, that we can instantly recognize that this is one of our enemy characters. And so that's just something that stood out to me, is that it can be a little bit visually confusing just because the uniforms are so similar. But yeah, this intro segment kind of shows us the epic aspect of the series. It shows us the types of combat that we can expect from these magical oil mechanics and how this war front is going. And so it's always a good idea with more of a slow burn series like this to introduce the important mechanics right away, the important factions right away, and also the power scaling, how it all works, and what type of conflicts we can expect in the future. And so this does a good job of setting all that up right here in the opening with that sequence. But then we jump to the actual plot. So we've seen the war front and we've seen combat, and now we meet our main character, who is going on a safari through the jungle to find a fabled source of more oil. And the immediate thing that stands out is the tonal shift. So we open with a sequence of two men using the last of their oil to blow up an enemy encampment, killing presumably like 4 or 5 people, only for one of their targets to survive and then come back and kill them too. And so it's a high-stakes, gritty trench warfare scenario where people are dying constantly, and it's a very desperate situation. And we contrast that with a very happy-go-lucky character who is apparently the best archaeologist in the nation, and it almost feels like she's not taking things seriously. And so it's kind of a strange way to introduce the character when, again, her quest is meant to save the lives of everybody in her nation, and she's kind of just smiling and singing and not really worrying about it all that much. And that is, I assume, probably by design. It's kind of meant to just show what type of personality she has, but it does kind of breed a sense of tonal inconsistency, and it almost makes us wonder, like, if she's taking this seriously, and if she's not, then how seriously are we, the reader, supposed to take it? Anyways, as we establish this expedition that we're on, we introduce our 3 main expeditioners, which is our purple-haired girl and her 2 protectors. She's got these 2 soldiers with her that are kind of just acting as escorts, even though she is apparently a higher rank than them. And so there's this frequent conflict that arises from one of our younger soldiers being hot-headed. He doesn't like how annoying the main character is. He can't stand her. He doesn't get along with her, and so he's constantly trying to give her orders, but she outranks him, so he isn't able to do that, and they just are constantly butting heads. And immediately we start to think, okay, this is a romance comic. We've got 2 characters that are constantly at odds with each other. Is this going to be enemies to lovers between purple hair and orange hair? And well, no, it's not. Our love interest is actually the rival oil archaeologist from the enemy nation, the guy in the thumbnail, presumably, and he hasn't met our main character yet, at least not on screen. And so it seems like we're doing a lot to build up the on-screen relationship between our protagonist and her escorts. And so, again, we get a lot of personality revealed from our purple-haired character and our orange-haired character. And, again, for introducing a romance in a comic, usually you put the 2 characters on screen as quickly as possible, and so it feels like we're building up something. We're building up some kind of tension between these 2 characters, even though they clearly aren't the leads, since the leads are in the thumbnail. And so just a little bit of an interesting aspect. And then there's a lot of expositional dialogue in this, which is a good idea to explain to the readers what's actually going on here, why it's going on, what our scenario is. And so it's clear that this was written, again, with the intention of introducing the reader to the world and introducing the reader to all of the important concepts and kind of explaining why all of this matters. But it's done in a way where it can be a little bit distracting just because it's obvious that it's exposition. And so our characters establish that they've been on this expedition for weeks, for 5 weeks, I think they've been, and we have our lead character still explaining the reason that they're there, even though everybody in this situation very, very clearly knows why they're there. They've been here for 5 weeks. They've probably had this conversation on the first day, and so it's good to establish to the readers what's happening, but it isn't blended very well, the exposition, because it just doesn't feel like a believable conversation that our characters would be having at this stage in their journey. And so, while it obviously needs to be there, the explanation needs to be there, I think that blending it a little bit more naturally could help, finding a better excuse for the characters to talk about these things that all of them know. Anyways, we end up in an altercation, and Panther attacks, and our hot-headed young male character throws a oil bomb at it, scaring it away but not killing it, and potentially giving the enemy a sight of their location. Only for us then to find the mystical fairy oil well that we were searching for. The characters drop down into it. Sorry, I think that happens in the next episode, yeah. And then we get a little bit of details about the connection the fairies have to the oil. So apparently the magical oil that we're using is connected to this ancient race of Fae, and their statues and their ruins and architecture tend to denote locations of oil. And so again, we're doing a good job of expositing, kind of explaining to the reader what's going on here. But for all the exposition that we are establishing to kind of set up this scenario, how the oil works and where the oil is found, I do feel like I have some lingering questions, and not all of them are immediately important, but there are a few things that I think it would be nice to know. So what we know initially is that this is a story about two nations that are at war with each other, and the reason that we're looking for this oil is so that we can sustain the war, because one side is about to run out, which will mean that they lose. And this war has been going on for generations. But what we don't know is why this war is actually going on. What are they fighting over? And it isn't necessarily important to get into complicated geopolitics about these two nations that we barely know anything about, but we spend a lot of time showing the contempt that these rival factions have for each other, and so they talk very negatively about the other sides, even though, again, their uniforms and their magic, their means of fighting seem very similar, and so they probably have some things in common, but we as readers don't actually know what they're fighting over. And so when we introduce a generations-long conflict where we have characters that are very hotly invested in it, to a point where it's serving as the anchor point, the center for our entire story, it would be nice if we had even just a single line of dialogue or just some kind of hint at like why that conflict is going on. What is at stake if our protagonists actually run out of oil? I mean, presumably they lose the war, but what does it mean to lose the war? Since we don't really know what it's being fought for, we don't really know what will happen if they don't get the oil that they need. Another question I have, one that's, again, not really important, but it's just a question that I kind of found on my mind, is if the characters are running out of magic oil to maintain the conflict, why are their only weapons these fossils and this oil? Wouldn't, say, a sword or a spear or a gun still be useful in that scenario? It seems like there's no reason that they can't use, like, practical, mundane forms of fighting in addition to the oil that they're so desperately running out of. And so that one's a bit of a nitpick, but it is something that was on my mind, particularly in that opening sequence where we have trench warfare going on. Anyways, we get further demonstrations of how the fossils work, how the oil works, with this endless rope concept that our characters use to climb down the hole into the well of oil where they locate A spring of water. Some kind of ancient ruin, only to be confronted by the rival expedition. And so, here we introduce the other guy from the thumbnail. And I found his introduction to be a little bit strange because we get this reveal, another voice comes from in the cave. Anakshin winning the eternal war, don't make me laugh. The only one who will be winning this war is me. He steps forward, he's got his fossil gun. And we introduce Oren Sternberg, known to you Noxians as the loyal archaeologist. And I think he's meant to be threatening, but what we kind of have is like a dreamy look on his face, where it's almost like, okay, here's the male lead, this is the love interest. But he's meant to be pointing a gun at them, so pleased to make your acquaintance. Amber Burrows, and she's shocked, and everybody is presumably terrified, but again, it's one of those things where, as an audience member, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be thinking when I see this, because it almost feels like a meet cute, even though it's happening at gunpoint. And so he's got this almost lovey face on when this is actually a very tense scenario. And I do have to ask the obvious question, and again, it's kind of a nitpick. I know that this is for the sake of the story or where the plot is going to go, but I do have to ask the obvious question, which is, if he had the jump on them, if they didn't know that him and his expedition were there, and he has a gun, and he's kind of pointing it in their general direction, and these nations are at war and they hate each other fiercely, why don't they just surprise attack the other expedition, kill them, and then take all the oil, since they're clearly poised to do that? And so I know it's one of those annoying, like, nitpick story questions, but I do have to ask, why don't they immediately attack instead of announcing their presence and having this meet cute? Wouldn't they be incentivized here to wipe out this expedition and take all of the spoils? And so that's kind of the type of little detail that I mean when I say that the tone is a bit strange on this one, because again, we have on one hand a desperate conflict where people are dying, presumably by the thousands, and then simultaneously it's a love story between two members of these rival nations, or at least it's presented as a love story based on the thumbnail and the romance genre. And it also is presented almost lighthearted, almost Disney-esque when we get down into the jungle and the oil well, but meanwhile there's a World War I style battle going on where people are blowing each other up with magic fossils, and so there's just a little bit tonally confusing, and again, I'm not really sure how I'm meant to interpret that, but I do think that this comic does a really good job of setting up its world and its lore, at least at a basic level, to where we understand what we need to understand to know what our characters are doing and why, and we're building a situation that is tense and interesting. So we've got the ticking clock of the front line is running out of oil, and we've got our main characters desperately searching to find some, but struggling to do so, and we're introducing all of their personalities along the way. And all of that is very well done, and so it is definitely an intriguing comic. I do find myself wondering what the focus of it is. Are we focused on the war, or are we focused on the romance? Are we focused on the fantasy or the romance? Is it a most epic or a most feels entry at heart? And I'm not really sure, because again, so much of the entry was spent wandering the jungle and kind of showing what the fossils are capable of, but yeah, I think that's the best way I could describe it is as tonally strange. It's very well done, it's well delivered, the art is very good, and again, there's a good sense of character personality, and so the writing is pretty solid in terms of that, but I'm not really sure about the tone. And it's kind of hard to predict what will happen next. It's kind of hard to tell what the overall framework is going to be here. So if this is going to be an unlikely romance between these two rivals, I think that maybe hinting a little bit more at that within the context of the 4 episodes that we have here would potentially help. Or if it's going to be more focused on the war, then showing more around that would potentially help. But because we have so many different tones, we've got the lackadaisical jungle adventure paired with the desperate fight in trench warfare paired with potentially a meet cute. It's just kind of throwing a little bit of everything at the screen, and it's hard to tell which elements are more important. And so, yeah, it's just, I think that's the best way I can describe it, is a little bit tonally inconsistent, and so tonally confusing, but otherwise very well done. I will be curious to see where it goes from here. Next we have How to Raise Your Werewolf by Clay McGoof. It is a fantasy drama. So the description reads, when Brett and Connor stumble across a strange girl in the woods, they have no idea what they're signing up for. She's scrappy, wild, and definitely not normal. With no name, no memory, and a serious bite, they agree to take care of her, just until they can figure out where she came from. But the more they uncover, the more threatening things get. She may not remember who she is, but something out there does, and it wants her back. Okay, so this series is pretty much about that. 2 guys move into a rural town, and they accidentally adopt a werewolf child. Now, that's all. That technically all does happen in the content of our 3 episodes, but the werewolf character only gets introduced in the end, and so we don't really get a whole lot of that. And I think that focusing more on the relationship that these 2 characters have with the werewolf that they've accidentally adopted probably would do a better job of setting it up. And so something I noticed with this is that the paneling is very done in a way where it's just barely reaching the 40 panel limit. And so you've got cutaways like this where it's clear, like, okay, we need a couple extra panels here, we got to get the panel count up. And so it feels like a lot of the shots, especially in this first episode, are just kind of added here to get it over the minimum. And so it's not really making efficient use of its screen time. It's actually padding it a little bit, just trying to get over that 40 panel mark, and so it makes it feel rushed and not intentional. And something else we have going on is the text often changes sizes, and generally you want to keep the text as much the same size as possible just to make sure that it's clear and easy to read. And so like text like this, for example, would be a little small on a cell phone. This would be hard to read. You might have to zoom in to see it, and so you want to make sure that everything is kind of kept standard. And the paneling here is a little bit strange and a little bit chaotic and kind of cluttered, and so some of that comes with the aspect of just adding extra panels to try and get over that 40 mark, but we've got just kind of clusters of panels in some cases. That's just visually a bit cluttered. And with all of the panels being so close together, there's not a lot of space in between them, and so it feels a little bit rushed. And so anyways, we spend 2 episodes introducing our 2 characters, and then we introduce a 3rd character and kind of show how they're adapting to their situation. They can't afford to live in the city anymore, so they're moving out into this tiny village in the woods where many disappearances happen and the locals aren't friendly. We then stumble upon an injured child in the woods. And she doesn't seem to remember anything. not even her own name, so they give her a name and they decide to look after her. At least for a little while, and that's essentially our setup. And so I think that we've done a good job of getting our inciting incident kind of out of the way, but this is that type of story where the characters meeting, introducing our werewolf is only step one of the incitation, because as of right now, the rest of our cast don't actually know that she's a werewolf yet, and so we would kind of want to build up that moment where they realize and then establish what the stakes are. So why can't we, report this to the police? Why can't we go to the hospital? Why should we look after her? And what is the thing that is chasing after her? Those are the types of things that you would want to have in there. And so kind of what this feels like to me is something that would work well as episode 1. If all 3 of these episodes got combined into one episode, maybe cut out some of the extra panels and just focus on the important elements, and then we have 2 more episodes of kind of showing the dynamic that these characters have and setting up the rest of the plot, introducing the antagonist, laying out the stakes, and setting up that conflict. This could be a really good introduction to the series, and so I think that the 3 episodes we have here, again, they work well as a potential episode 1, but it feels like we don't quite have enough here to get latched onto, and we kind of cut right before the interesting stuff has happened. And so I think it's a fun idea, and it definitely conveys a sense of personality that sets it up as a potentially very fun story, but I think we just aren't quite getting to that fast enough. And so a little bit more building out of the plot, maybe speeding up the pacing, or otherwise adding more panels so that we can just have more going on in it would help. Another problem that I think this one is going to have is that it's a fantasy drama, but it's fantasy first, which means it's competing in the most epic category, whereas the only epic thing that happens in this is a werewolf movie that our characters are watching in the opening scene. And so I don't know if it's quite grasping what that category is meant to, and I don't know if it's in the right category, whereas if there is going to be more epic scenarios happening, werewolf battles or tense situations like that, I mean, if it's more focused on werewolves fighting each other, you could put it in epic and it would feel good there. If it's more focused on the thrilling aspect of being hunted by an angry werewolf mother, then you could put it under most gripping. It would fit in really well there. But if it's just a feel-good slice of life with a werewolf, then it could probably go under most feels. But I feel like most epic is currently the place that it belongs the least, just based on what it's shown to us. But again, it could be that it is something that belongs in the epic category. We just haven't got to the epic parts yet. And so I think that it's a little bit too short for its own good. And so it's good that it hit the minimums, but it doesn't really show us what type of series this is going to be, what we can really expect going forward. And again, there's elements in the description that haven't happened yet in the comic, and if we had gotten to those parts, it would be a little bit more engaging. Nevertheless, though, I did find it fun to read, and I do look forward to seeing more of it. Okay, next we have Strial, Samedi's book by Lexus GM. It is a supernatural fantasy. And the description reads, betrayed by their village, Aaron and Laura try to flee, but are overtaken by a fanatical mob. Mortally wounded, Aaron refuses to give in to his fate, crying out his refusal to die. His call echoes in the afterlife, and death itself answers. Faced with this entity, Aaron is offered a second chance, but at what price? So, this one was a very interesting read, and it establishes some interesting ideas, but I do think that it's kind of fumbled a little bit in terms of getting to the broader point, and this is kind of a common criticism that I find myself making reading a lot of these entries, but I found this one enjoyable to read, but I feel like it lingers a little bit too long on some scenes when it could be spending that time kind of building up what the plot is actually going to be about. And so the basic introduction is that a man and his pregnant wife are running away from angry villagers who think his wife is a witch. It seems that she actually is, and they are going to kill her for that. And so in order to catch the wife, they first have to deal with the husband, and so they overwhelm him and kill him. But because of his desperate situation, he refuses to die, which means he is a problem for the death entity. And so he ends up making some kind of deal wherein by giving his soul to Death, Death agrees to protect his wife. That develops over the course of the several episodes that we have here, but we really linger a long time on this conversation that he has with Death when there are only a handful of important details in the conversation. I feel like we could probably have trimmed it down a little bit and kind of gotten to the point a little bit faster, because we're spending so long on this conversation that again, it just feels like it's kind of clear what direction that the talk is going to go. It's kind of clear, like, what our overall outcome is going to be here. And so we intuit that pretty quickly as the audience, and so we kind of just want to see it happen. And it feels like this talk they have just drags on a little bit too long. And so we slowly come to a conclusion. And again, our character makes a deal with Death in order to save his wife. We hint at other deities out there that might not be happy about the situation. And then, as the man's wife is about to be burned at the stake, he reappears, now possessed by Baron Samedi, and saves her. But it seems that he is not himself anymore, and so that's kind of where we end. Let's see. And so this is all a very interesting scenario. The art is very good. It has a great sense of style. There's a sense of momentum to it, and it's intriguing, I think I would say. It's very, very intriguing. But I don't really feel like I've got a good grasp of what the story truly is about. So obviously, again, our main character has died. He made a deal with Death, and now seemingly Death is puppeteering his body. This is Baron Samedi. This is not the man that it once was, but he's using his body in order to save his pregnant wife so that their unborn child can live. And he does save her, and well, I think it's a very interesting scenario. I just can't find myself I find myself wondering what's next. Where does it actually go from here? Because we don't really know what to expect from this point onward. He's got the wife. They escape. He introduces himself as Death, and so there we end off. And again, it's just our character sold his soul to Death, and now Death is possessing his body, and now his wife and baby are safe. And now what? And the what's next is the really, really important question, because what we've seen so far is very interesting, but we haven't been given enough information to even speculate on what might happen after this. And so it's really hard to tell what this story could be about. Is it going to be some kind of romance between Death and this witch? Probably not. It's not a romance story, but is there going to be some kind of ongoing altercation? I mean, we don't really know that. What is the next move of this pregnant woman who is being looked after by Death? I mean, where does she go from here? How does this develop? Because from this point in the story, I mean, she could just live in a cabin in the woods and happily ever after. Nothing might happen after this, because we, the audience, haven't been introduced to any further consequences for this story. And so we just don't really know where it's going to go from here. And I think that it could have spent more time establishing that. So what are the consequences for Death taking this man's body and committing these actions? Is this going to annoy that goddess that we talked about in the second and third episodes? Those are the types of things that we would want to see a little bit more of, just to kind of know, like, what the overall direction of this comic is, what type of story this is going to be. I feel like we needed a little bit more. But again, very good art, very interesting story. It just doesn't quite build a clear road for the future of the narrative. So those are things that I would look for more. I'll be curious to see where it goes, though. And next we have Deity Zero by Harmony10. It is a supernatural action. It says, Emma survived her suicide attempt, but something inside her changed. As her mind unravels, she begins to question what's real, what's imagined, and if she's still in control. So, I don't know, like, the description doesn't quite match. So it says, again, Emma survived her suicide attempt. That's the opening line of the description. But that's never mentioned in the comic, and so it's not really clear, like, if that's something that hasn't happened yet or if that happened before the comic. But I found that line confusing. So anyways, let's go ahead and dive into it, and well, I guess she says, what if I died on that day? So the implication is that it already happened. That's going to be my fault for missing that. It seems to be that it already happened, but it isn't really elaborated on. And things not being elaborated on is kind of the overall theme for this comic. I found it to be very well done visually, and it does a good job of building scenes and kind of establishing characters, but it's kind of hard to tell what it's actually about. And so we have our main character, who is this red-haired girl who isn't popular. She's being bullied by these other awful ladies, and then the popular blonde steps in to save her and kind of sets up that she's willing to look after her and be her friend or what have you. But there's certain aspects of it that are strange or mysterious. So her eyes glow red right before the blonde shows up, and so it seems like there's some kind of connection between these two. We just don't really know what it is, and we don't really find out either. And again, when the description kind of declares that we're following a character that isn't sure what's real, it definitely makes us second guess, okay, well, what's actually happening here? And so we're going to be looking for little hints like that, just to try and get an idea of, well, what is happening? What is going on? What is real? Like, how much of this is literal, and how much of it is perhaps hinting at something different going on? And so Brenda Parker absent, and so I think the best way to describe it is kind of confusing. It's clearly trying to do something interesting with the mystery and the only person that acknowledges my existence is Aurora. Okay, so Aurora's not Brenda, and so, see, having the bully not show up after that weird confrontation they had, I thought would be interesting, but and there's something happening with the teacher. He acknowledges the character. He says he knows her secret, but then she realizes, wait, that was just kind of a dream, and she collapses and gets taken to the nurse's office. But yeah, it's like it's confusing, but I think it's supposed to be confusing. We're supposed to be, again, questioning, well, okay, what's actually going on here? What's actually happening here? But the trouble is we don't get enough of an explanation for what is happening here. And so 3 episodes in, we don't need to have all the answers, but we do want to kind of have an idea of what this comic is actually about. And so I think there's a good job at building scenes visually. I like the more muted colors, the choice of shots. I think all that stuff is good, but I find myself kind of leaving this after 3 episodes. I don't feel like I actually know what this story is about or what direction it's meant to be taking, and I haven't even got a clue. And so I think it's interesting, but it's hard to be interested in because I don't know enough of what's actually going on. And so this kind of feels like it isn't finished. It's like we're missing information, and I could be mistaken, but I think this is speculation on my part, but I think it might not be finished, because I actually remember reading the first episode, and it was actually the content of the first 2 episodes, and then it seems like what the author did was split the first episode into 2 episodes so that they would have time to finish this next part and then meet the minimum requirements for the contest. I could be wrong on that, but I remember the first episode being the length of the first 2 episodes, and so it seems like maybe they didn't get done in time and kind of finish setting up that whatever that interesting hook is. Kind of like we need a little bit of a hook. We need an explanation of what this is actually about, where this is actually going, and just kind of more hints in that direction, because as it stands right now, we've got a girl that's being bullied in school. There's something strange about her. There's possibly something strange about the teacher, and it's tied to these cutaway shots where they have red eyes, but that's it. And it's labeled as a supernatural action show, so obviously something supernatural is happening, and presumably this will lead to action in the future, but we really don't see any of that. There's no real hint at supernatural other than the one shot of her with red eyes, which we don't know the meaning of, and there's not really much action either other than her getting kicked by a bully. And so yeah, it just feels like it hasn't quite got to the point. It feels like it's missing something, and so it's very interesting, and I think it's well done, but it just hasn't quite got to the point yet. It feels like we're still halfway through episode 1. I would describe it like that. It feels like we're halfway through the first episode of introducing the characters. Okay. Finally, we come to Unscripted. Oh my goodness, this will be my longest video yet. I really seem to have lost track of time. So this will be our last comic for the day, Unscripted by Eins Arts. It is a romance drama, and the description reads, despite the hardships of life and working as a food delivery man, Lee Hyun-ki was content living with his sister and mother. However, his world was turned upside down when he lost both his mother and sister due to someone's actions. Determined to seek revenge, he entered the entertainment industry as an actor. While preparing for his plan, he met a girl who worked as a film director. Now, he finds himself torn between love and revenge. What would he choose? And so this description pretty much does describe almost everything that happens in the comic, except for this last line, torn between love and revenge, what would he choose? We don't get the love established in the comic, and so that's something that I think is going to work a little bit against it. And so this is a romance by category. And so we spend really the first 2 episodes kind of establishing our character's backstory. We know that he's from a kind of poor family. It's just him, his mom, and his sister, and they're doing whatever they can to make ends meet, so everybody's working a lot. His sister gets a job as an actor, but then she is tricked into being abused by some of the producers, and then she ends up dying under questionable circumstances. And our main character believes that she was murdered. And so he obviously knows that a little more went on here than what the official story was, and so he wants to get revenge on the producer that did this to her. And so in order to facilitate that revenge, he tries to get into the entertainment industry by auditioning as an actor, and he doesn't make the cut, but he does get picked up by a random director walking by that notices him and thinks that he has a look that she's looking for. And so the story's told a little bit out of order. We kind of start with all of that in the first episode. We get the brothers audition at the end of the episode, and then we flash back to the scenario that shows what happens to his sister. And so it was a little confusing when I first read it, just because we're kind of flashing forward and then flashing back. And so we start with this setup of, again, our family being kind of poor, and then we jump forward to the part where he's auditioning. Or rather, we talk about the death of the sister, and then we jump to the audition, and he doesn't get the part. But then we jump back to before the sister was dead and show what events led to her death. And so it is a little bit jarring, because we're expecting him to be meeting his potential love interest, but now we're thrown back in time again. And so it seems like we probably could have just told this story linearly. I don't think we really needed to jump forward to the meeting with the director, although it is usually a good idea in a romance to bring in both leads as quickly as possible. So, we the reader, we want to know who's the love interest for our main character. And so I assume that's why they did that, just because you usually want to kind of have the important characters introduced right off the bat. But it does read a little bit confusingly in sequence. And so here we have this horrible scenario with the sister, and then her untimely death. And then we jump back to the present, where we're working on some kind of revenge plan. And so I think that something that this story would really benefit from as a drama is doing more to establish what the main character's plan actually is. So he wants to get revenge on the producer that he thinks has murdered his sister, but he seems to plan to do that by getting a job as an actor for the same company. And it's not really clear how that's going to help him get revenge. So seemingly he wants to get closer to the producer so that he can enact whatever his revenge plan is, but we don't actually know what the plan is. And so is he just going to beat him up the first time he sees him? I mean, how is he going to go about actually getting his revenge? How does becoming an actor help him get his revenge? If he's just going to attack the guy, presumably he could just figure out where he's at and find some way to do that. He doesn't necessarily need to be on the inside in order to make that happen. And so it just isn't quite clear what his goal is. Is he trying to get close to him so he can expose his illegal activities? That might be interesting, but we don't really know. All we know is that he wants revenge, and in order to get revenge, he's trying to become an actor for some reason. And again, he gets noticed by this director who wants to hire him on as an actor so that she can make him into a star based off his unique and fitting looks for the part. And that's kind of where it ends. She puts him into acting training and tries to develop him as a talent, but I feel like we don't really go far enough to establish an attraction between these two characters, since I assume that the director and our main character are going to be the romance. That's what's implied by the first episode and also the thumbnail, but at this stage in the comic, their relationship is strictly professional, and we don't really have much personal interaction between them, and so it's not really enough to get invested in the love story, because we don't really see those sparks between them. We don't really see the chemistry that they might have, and so I think that a little bit more emphasis on building the romance between them would help, since we want something that we can really bite into and get attached to, and we just haven't quite got to that yet. So we've spent all of our time essentially building our main character's backstory, which is important, but I think we could probably have combined episodes 1 and 2 and then used 2 and 3 to kind of focus on the budding romance that we're meant to have, since it is primarily a romance story. And so we know at this point our main character is entirely focused on revenge, and we don't really do a lot to set up romantic tension between him and his new director. And so that's the type of thing that I would probably try to focus more on. We know as readers that this is our main couple, but we haven't really seen any hint between these two characters at them becoming romantically involved, and I just think that we could probably use a little bit more of that. Nevertheless, I think the story does a pretty good job of building itself out. It creates scenarios that are easy to understand and easy to follow, and it is very dramatic. And so it's definitely more drama than romance, at least in these first 3 episodes. And so it's good about that, about creating that sense of important events happening. And so I think it definitely has potential. I just would like to see what type of romance we're going to get. I think we got mostly drama in these first 3 episodes. I would have liked to see more romance. But yes, very intriguing story. I shall be curious to see where this goes. And that is going to be all for today. And if you enjoyed this commentary and like the video, then you might enjoy checking out my contest entry, Dumpster Girl. It is a story about garbage. Otherwise, I've got a handful of series left to review at this point. I'm actually almost caught up, finally, and so I'll look into getting those last few series reviewed, and then we'll see where we go from there. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you in your nightmares.